I think young people are having to navigate a more racially charged environment than potentially my generation had to. I think we'd made real progress, and all of a sudden we've come to things like the referendum, and we seem to have stepped backwards as a nation, particularly in terms of what we're exposed to through media. So while I don't actually believe that we have more people who are racist in Australia than we've ever had before, what I do feel we have is more exposure to events of racism.
Thank you so much, Clinton, for joining us on today's episode. I also want to say something that I don't usually say at the beginning when I have a guest that comes on. And I also just want to say thank you for the work that you do as well. I feel like it's really, really needed. I don't know why I'm getting emotional at the beginning of this, but here we are. Just like it means it's amazing just what you do. And it actually gets me thinking a lot about, wow, it takes a certain person to do the work that you do. And what I'm actually curious about is to hear more about your story. You know, like what was your upbringing like?
Yeah, Yama Gabiata, Gabaninda. So hi, and thank you. You know, it means a lot to know that there's people out there that do recognise the importance of, you know, the work that so many of us are trying to do in the social emotional wellbeing space at present, particularly given the tough times that we seem to be continually trying to navigate. So really do appreciate that. Yeah, my story is pretty interesting, particularly how I ended up in this field of psychology and the broader social emotional wellbeing space. You know, I guess I'll start all the way back in my childhood because it really stems from there. And you know, I experienced a lot of abuse from when I was about the ages of 5 to 15, and I probably didn't cope with that abuse in the most positive ways. And I guess I was recognised as a delinquent, you know, by the time I was a teenager, and then by the time I was sort of 15, and definitely by 16, you know, I was couch surfing and had left home and had basically turned to drugs and alcohol as a way of trying to navigate the experiences of trauma that I'd had. And it took me a really long time to figure out that all that was doing was creating further trauma, both for myself and those that actually did care about me and did love me. So it was a long learning journey, but in that space of time, I guess both fortunate and unfortunate at the same time. It was a bit of a double-edged sword. I was extremely high functioning throughout that whole period, so I still managed to, you know, do high school by correspondence, to complete a chef's apprenticeship, to work in some of the best restaurants both here in Australia, and then to move overseas and to work in some really well-known restaurants in the UK and other parts of Europe as well. And it was in that period while I was overseas that I really started to reflect on what I wanted to do when I came home. I made a decision that I definitely didn't want to continue in the hospitality in the hospitality sort of space, and that a lot of the issues that I was continuing with were being driven by hospitality and the pressures of that space and the habits of that space. So I knew I wanted to disconnect myself from that lifestyle and do something different, but I really didn't know what or how. But I'd started to write up, I guess, a bunch of programs that I thought would be beneficial to other young people that may have gone through similar things to me, similar life experiences, and maybe turned to similar negative coping strategies in that period, and thought there must be a way that we can help young people to just stay passionate and connected to the things that they really love. And as a young Aboriginal person, you know, unless you were good at sport, there wasn't many opportunities for you when I was a young fella. So, you know, if you played football or you could run fast, then yeah, you probably had a few avenues in front of you to at least help you through high school and maybe into a professional sort of sport career post that. But if you were into the arts, or if you're into academia or anything else really outside of sport, your options were limited. So I really wanted to be able to come back and help young people to stay connected to and maintain that passion they had with whatever it was that they were good at and that they cared about.
But Are You Happy is like that brutally honest friend whose advice you'll actually want to take. This season, we explore the psychology of perfectionism, how you can stop taking things so personally, and why group chats can feel so draining, plus what you can do about it. Our friends at Medibank understand that connection matters, especially during challenging times. That's why they've created the Medibank Family Roast, a card game designed to get families actually talking and connecting with each other. Because when family bonds are stronger, Australia is stronger. So get together and play the Medibank Family Roast. Search Medibank Family Roast. Live better with Medibank.
And I came back to Australia and I started hitting up some large organisations with these programs that I'd written up, and I got really positive feedback. It was like, these programs are great, but what's your qualification? And every time I'd say, well, mate, I'm a chef. And they'd basically just go, well, what the hell has that got to do with these programs that you've brought us and presented? And I'd say, well, nothing, but I've got a lot of lived experience. I've been one of these kids, and I've managed to make a go of it for myself in the chefing space, and I think I've got something to offer. And they all just said, yeah, that's great, but come back when you've got a qualification saying that you are capable of doing this. So I went, okay then. And I took myself off to Griffith University and went into the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Student Support Centre there. And I went and met with a couple of aunties there. And I just was like, aunts, this is kind of what I want to do. What do I need to study? And they just started writing out all these different programs on a piece of paper, and it just started to confuse me, to be honest. So I kind of just looked at the piece of paper, started swirling my finger, and I just threw it down on something. And here I am. I ended up in psychology and saw that through. And yeah, the rest is kind of continued history from there. I did my honours with Griffith University, completed my PhD at Griffith University. I worked in the space of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander social-emotional wellbeing as an academic and as a practitioner for the last 2 decades now.
Wow, that's incredible. And it's really amazing because like what I'm hearing in it as well is that I feel like some of the greatest people is their ability to be able to turn pain into their purpose. And that's what I'm kind of hearing in your story as well, which is really beautiful. And also just recognizing the hardships that you went through as well. So really honoring you on your journey as well.
Yeah, thank you. No, I was fortunate enough to have the right people at the right times to help me get through that. And so that's something I'm really passionate about today, is being able to hopefully be that person for others, help them to see a different path. And, that's required me to make some big changes in my life. So, I had to reflect on that period and go, well, the drug and alcohol abuse that may have been helping me to run from the trauma wasn't actually helping with it. And so I didn't want my children to sort of learn those same habits. And we live on the Gold Coast, that most people recognise as party central. And so I had to make an active decision that if they were going to have the opportunity to learn something different, the only way to sort of bring that about was for me to create it in our own house and sort of start from there. So, yeah, the last 13 years I've been sort of straight and sober and trying to do my best to deal with my traumas in more positive ways.
Yeah, congratulations. It's amazing as well because I think you mentioned the right people at the right time. And what I'm curious about as well is like, how has culture and community helped to reclaim and strengthen your identity since then? Because it sounds, as you said, it was this long journey for you.
Yeah, culture's been the main thing to keep me on track and to get me back on track in anything that I've tried to achieve, and particularly the last 15 years of my life. It's we've had such strong fundamentals as Aboriginal peoples for, we'd say, since Gubba Bidui, so the beginning of time, on how to be in a good relationship with ourselves, other, and place across time. And we've tended to sort of sway away from those a little bit, and colonization has done a good job of trying to push us away from those at times. But I think we're in a time now where we've got this wonderful opportunity to be able to reconnect, relearn, reconnect, and to look at how do we use those old principles that kept us well for so long, and how do we use those in today's systems and societies to keep us strong and deadly moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually really interesting, like hearing more about the things that you're doing in the present day moment or what you believe is missing. you're the director of the First Nations strategy at Black Dog Institute, which is incredible. Love to hear more about the work that you do there as well.
Yeah, so I'm really fortunate to have the job that I do and to be able to work with such a wonderful organisation like the Black Dog Institute. The people and the passion there is just palpable. People are there because they care about what they do. We're not the highest paying workplace on the planet, but we're driven by passion, and I think that's one of the magical ingredients that we've actually got. And we've got some wonderful minds, we've got some wonderful skills, we've got some wonderful lived experience knowledges as well that I think, when all brought together, allow us to really look at how do we use research to make change. So we're really passionate about ensuring that we're not just doing research for research purposes in this mental health and broader social emotional wellbeing space, that we're doing research for a purpose, that our translation work is just as important as our research work. So nothing is just a piece of paper sitting on a shelf and gathering dust, that in some shape or form, everything that we're doing from our research is translatable and implementable back into communities and trying to bring around change. So my little space within there is obviously as the director of First Nations strategy. And so we've got kind of two arms that we do. We've got our research arm, and then we've got how do we turn that into something useful, our translation arm. I've got a great team around me. They make me look really intelligent, really capable, far more than I'd ever claimed to be myself, which is awesome. And I've got full trust in them to do the work that they need to do. So we work really well, and I hope that that's a really good guide for others within our organisation about how you can use those elements of trust and empowerment to really have strong and purposeful and productive teams.
Beautiful. There was something you were saying before around fundamentals, and I actually have heard you speak on a previous interview around how Aboriginal psychology is actually very different to Western psychology. Would love to hear more about that because I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, there's massive differences between, I guess, Western reflections of psychology and, in this case, Aboriginal people's, I guess, understandings of a broader notion of social and emotional well-being. Why I say in this case is because I actually think this is a human perspective. I don't actually see it as a pure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective. I think it's just a perspective that more fits for human beings who are being, whereas psychology at times doesn't necessarily look at all the other facets that make us what we are as beings. So, everything for us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is based around relationships. And that's those relationships that we first and foremost have with ourselves that allows us to then have relationship with other. And other can be people, it can be place, it can be the cosmos, it can actually be the words that we speak. So there is a relationship built into everything, which then helps us to understand what is my role and responsibility, what are the obligations, reciprocal that exist within those relationships. So there's a higher call, I guess, to being mindful about the impacts of what you choose to create through those processes. And I think that's a really beautiful way to start reflecting on how we can get along better with both ourselves, but then with others and everything else around us. So some of the elements that are really important to us and are well documented are things like connection to culture, connection to country, connection to environment, nature, as well, for those that may not necessarily know country because of things that have happened, and connection to our ancestors, to be honest. Again, some of the things that hold us well in who we are and in our overall well-being are things that psychology would suggest are unreal or not present. I'm well documented for telling people that I spend a lot of my time talking to dead people and trees. If I walked into most psychology practices and said I spend a lot of my spare time talking to dead people and trees, they'd probably want to send me off to a psychiatrist and have me medicated, rather than seeing that as a fundamental piece of my well-being.
Wow, that is so true. And I love that you do that. I love talking to trees. I love connecting to nature. And it's so funny because I find it so refreshing, yet it is so important. Like, we've lost touch of the things that are so important. So I think it's really great that you're really paving the way in a way, which is sad because it shouldn't be a way that you need to pave in the first place.
Yeah, 100% agree. And, some of the best lessons that I've had in my life have just come from things in nature that most people spend their days just walking past or would never bother to spend the time to and allow themselves to learn from. I think, at times as human beings, and particularly within Western societies, we've allowed ego to get in the way of us actually seeing ourselves as part of. We see ourselves as more than, and that's led to this disconnect and our inability to really allow ourselves to learn from the everyday lessons that exist around us in nature.
So true. And I actually have heard you talk about this previously around how psyche, what does psyche actually mean? And I found that so interesting, and I really want you to tell our listeners because I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, if we really take it back to old Latin, when we're talking about psyche, we're actually talking about the spirit. We're not actually talking about the mind. So the field of psychology in its essence should be about maintaining the spirit rather than fixing mental ill health or maintaining mental health. So that's, I guess, the reflection that I use in the work we do. And it's a common sort of understanding or theme amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. You'll more commonly hear us talking about having a broken spirit than you will us talking about feeling mentally unwell.
Yeah, that's so true. So what do you think mainstream mental health systems still misunderstand most then?
I think the biggest divide that we actually have, and it's not just in the mental health space, it's in, I guess, the societal difference space. And that's that we live in one of the most individualized nations in the world, being Australia. We're ranked as the second most individualist nation in the world, and people can look that up on the Hofstede website. We have been there for several decades. We were about third, and then we bumped up to second more recently. So we've got a whole bunch of people living in Australia who function through a very individualistic lens of how to be. And we have a whole bunch of systems that have been created through that lens. So that has inherently led to a whole bunch of epistemic discrimination existing in our systems that impact on people who come from collectivist-based societies. And we're in a situation in Australia where we have all these Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander societies here, groups within Australia, who we all come from some of the most collective-based societies known globally. So there's an inherent conflict just in that I think as an Australian nation we're still struggling to sort of overcome. And I think we're another space that we're getting better at, but I think we've got a history of working in the space of ill health rather than allowing ourselves to work in the space of health and well-being. And there's a corporatization that's kind of happened around that. But I think we are improving in that, and it's great to see.
And when you mean by there's a corporatization around that, can you share more about that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so if I really reflect on situations within developed countries and you look at the things that are really driving our ill health and despair, they're things that we generally accept as being normal parts of our life. So we create these situations where people have better access to unhealthy food than they do healthy food. We create situations where people are put in positions where both parents have to work full time from when their children are really young, which creates situations of disconnect between children and older people and other generations. We have, at the other end of that scale, we have an aged care system that leads to disconnect between young people and old people, so that generational learning's not occurring. They're all things that actually, have been monetized. And in their own shape or form, they add to the distress that is being experienced by people within society today. And if we flip that all around, and if we really cared about health and well-being, then we'd be looking at how do we increase the opportunities people have to remain connected to the things that we know keep them well. How do we make sure that people have the opportunities to maintain connections to their family? How do we help increase the opportunities that people have the opportunity to form a strong sense of positive identity as connected to a place and the others within that place? And I just don't think we've got there yet.
You were talking a bit before around discrimination and essentially when two ways of being can come into conflict. When we talk about racism, what kinds of harms are most often missed in public conversations?
Yeah, I think when we're having these discussions around racism and discrimination, we need to be prepared to really take it back to that form of racism that lies within epistemic. So epistemic discrimination is the discrimination that simply exists within thought. So whose thought led to the systems? Whose thought led to what we create as such? And so in Australian society, you know, we've had one overarching influence that has led to a whole bunch of policies, procedures, systems, et cetera, that haven't necessarily been inclusive.
Yeah.
And so that's meant that there's a whole bunch of people that they don't necessarily work for. So I think that's where we need to start. We need to really step it back and go, you know, what we see out on the football field or what we see in the schoolyard or what we see in the workplace is in itself inherently a product of what was created back here. So we need to be prepared to look at, well, how do we allow new thought in that can help to then shift systems? And for me, that's about us embracing First Nations knowledges. You know, we're the oldest practitioners, environmentalists, business people, artists, whatever you want to reflect on the planet. And we've got a whole bunch of knowledge there that can be really beneficial to humanity. And I'd suggest that far more of us are wanting to share that than are not. But we want to share when we know it's going to be, one, respected, and two, used in the way that it was intended. So that's where I think we need to be doing the work, is in terms of how do we bring people forward to ensure that the knowledges that we hold, that we think can be beneficial for everybody, are going to be respected, are not going to be stolen and used, one, or potentially against us, or two, for individual financial gain in some shape or form, being collective-based knowledges. So I think if we allow more First Nations peoples the opportunities to share First Nations knowledges in influential platforms such as this, such as some of the conferences that some people listening to this may have heard me presenting at, I think that's a wonderful opportunity to let people dip their toes into thinking about another way of thought.
Absolutely. Yeah. I guess my next question is around, how does everyday racism accumulate over time and affect the well-being for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
That's the key word, is accumulate. And that really is what is the damaging effect. You know, we all experience discrimination at some shape of form and time in our lives. The difference for many people as compared to others is that the exposure and the experiences are so frequent that you don't have time to process or heal from each one. So for us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, our lived experience is one of experiencing individual, systemic, institutional discriminations and racism so constantly that we don't get to heal. So two things come from that: a snowballing effect, whereas it just accumulates and builds up. And we see the damages in terms of people's social emotional well-being from that. But the other thing that happens is we build a sensitivity to it. But then we get called out on our sensitivity. People go, "Oh, you're just too sensitive." And what we fail to recognize in that moment is sensitivity is a protective factor.
Totally.
Like people build a sensitivity to certain things as a way of being able to recognize it, identify it before it has opportunity to harm. So yes, we are far more sensitive to racism than some other people in Australia are, but that's unfortunately because we're exposed to it more often, and we've had to learn, how do I identify it before it does more harm than potentially it may. And then to get called out on that just drives the circle even further.
Yeah. And are you able to give some examples of what does that actually look like? Like you mentioned some of those different types of racism, just because I'm sure there's people listening in that, you know, really want to be allies in this space for Indigenous people.
Individual racism is that racism that is, you know, projected at individuals or small groups of individuals as such. So as I mentioned earlier, it could be the stuff that we see in the workplace or that we hear on the school grounds or on sports fields, whatever it is, where people are being heckled for who they are. Institutional racism is then the racism that is built within institutions. So, we know that institutions were created through that certain form of epistemic that has led them to work really well for some people and to not work at all for other people. So institutional racism is the racism that we're exposed to within institutions because of the existence of that. So that might be in the form of certain policies or procedures within the workplace not working for everybody in the workplace. So you might have something like a bereavement policy in a workplace that suggests you can have 2 days off or 3 days off in the event of a immediate family member passing away. You then might have somebody who has had multiple members of their family pass away in a short period of time, one, because of the heightened risk that is experienced by many people within that group. So for us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, because of colonisation and because of ongoing oppression, we are at heightened risk of experiencing a whole bunch of chronic diseases, a whole bunch of mental health concerns and others that may lead to a greater likelihood of, unfortunately, something happening. So then you've got that. So you might have then taken multiple times or multiple periods off work because you've had to attend to multiple forms of sorry business, and then you might get questioned about that by your manager.
Yeah.
So you might have a manager go, how many aunties can you really have? You've said you've been off for an auntie's funeral 3 times over in the last 3 months. I actually had this at a university that I was working at, where I had someone in a senior position in that university question me about how many grandparents I had, because I'd been off for multiple funerals in a short period of time for people that I recognised as grandparents to me, either through family or culturally. And so that's a form of institutional discrimination. Systemic discrimination then takes that even broader, and it's the discrimination that exists within the systems that then our institutions exist in, that we as individuals then exist through as well. So larger systems things could be things like the way that certain measures within child safety assessments are constructed in a way that inherently puts or classes Aboriginal children at higher risk than others for no other reason than they happen to be Aboriginal. That then puts you at an immediate greater risk of removal than non-Indigenous people. So that's a systemic racism.
How are young First Nations people coping with the world today, especially post the voice referendum?
I think young people are having to navigate a more racially charged environment than potentially my generation had to. I think we'd made real progress, and all of a sudden we've come to things like the referendum, and we seem to have stepped backwards as a nation, particularly in terms of what we're exposed to through media. So while I don't actually believe that we have more people who are racist in Australia than we've ever had before, what I do feel we have is more exposure to events of racism. So be that through how it's cast in media, or then how it may be how people are viewing that through social media platforms or being exposed to it through social media platforms. And I think that social media space has led to a constant exposure. So for a young person who may experience some racism within school, traditionally they could have tapped out from that when they came home and at least had a little bit of freedom from it.
Yeah.
Spent time with their family, slept overnight, been able to go back to school. Even if it happened at school the next day, they've still had a slight respite period. In many instances, that's not present now because social media is there 24/7. And I think if people are experiencing racism and discrimination and hate speech through those platforms, then they are going to experience it far more frequently than others may around them. And I think there's a damaging impact to that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess, for any First Nations people listening to this episode who may be struggling with their self-worth, identity and mental health, what would you want to say to them right now?
Look, for me, what I really want young people to recognise is your indigeneity, your Aboriginality, whoever your mob is, that part of you is the strongest part of you. It is the most positive, most powerful, most protective thing that you can actually have. And it's something we should hold on to real dearly because, to be honest, it's something that we have that others may never, ever experience. Others will never experience the connection to country that I have when I go home, if they're not from there. And I won't experience that where I live here on Gamilaraay country. It's something we recognise because we have that strong connection to a particular place. And I think, at times I feel sorry for people who may never get to have that experience in their life because they're so disconnected from their own histories.
Yeah.
A lot of young people today don't even know where their grandparents are from, or their great-grandparents, or what the history is that led their families to be here in Australia. So they don't even have that opportunity a lot of the time to start unpacking and learning about where do I come from? What does that mean in terms of who I am, how I act, what I am or am not comfortable with in my life. So and it's the same again when I go out to remote communities. I think sometimes out there, young people out in those remote communities get so fixated on what they think they're missing out on. And I'm always just trying to drag them back to recognizing what they have that city folk just never going to have. They've got freedoms that you can't imagine. I go out to some of these communities, they're riding a horse down the main street.
I love
or
that.
they're riding their motorbikes past the police station, their dirt bikes past the police station. I live out here in Talabudra Valley, and if me and my kids ride our dirt bikes in the big empty forest up the back here, police get called. So, it's a polar opposite. And so I think sometimes we really need to get back to appreciating what is it that I have and how can I turn to that to keep me strong and deadly, rather than allowing myself to get so fixed to what I think I'm missing out on. And it's all a perception.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know you just mentioned about connection to country. But for listeners who may not fully understand what connection to country actually is, how would you explain its role in social and emotional well-being?
So connection to country has been shown through all the research for a long time now to be one of the strongest protective factors to social and emotional well-being. You will constantly hear Aboriginal peoples talking about how when they need to heal, they go home, they go back to country. And I think that's because we've held on to the knowledge that we are what we've come from. I am the dust that makes up my country. I am made up of the exact same minerals as everything that's on that country. And so when you allow yourself to let go again of the ego and everything that we've been led to believe it is to be human, and just get back to I'm a part of nature and I'm actually a part of that ecosystem right there. There's a real power in that that allows you to just find a space of silence from all the noise that fills our minds and our spirits in our general life.
Totally. And it's interesting as well, because as you talk about it, I'm like, it just, we have been in this individualistic culture, absolutely, like what you were talking about before. And if anything, it's way less stressful if we lean into collective ways of being, because you're like, oh, I don't need to do this alone. Oh, I can actually get support in these really beautiful ways that have obviously have been working for thousands and thousands of years. So, it's just, it constantly confuses me as well, just seeing it all.
Yeah, there's so much protective factors in being a member of a collective. Like you just said, you've got other people that you can turn to in tough times. You've got other people that are going to be there to look out for you, to share with you. There comes role and responsibility with that. I've got to be prepared that if I'm in a position where I've had the opportunity to gather more wealth, gather more resources, gather more skills, knowledge, whatever it might be, that I actually have a responsibility to share that around a bit in whatever way I actually can. And I think that's a wonderful thing. There is risk factors that come with it though, and I mentioned one of those before in terms of, unfortunately, when you're connected to more people and more things, you're more likely to experience loss. If I see more people as family, I'm more likely to lose family because there's more people identified in that group. If I see myself as connected to certain animals and all of a sudden those animals' habitats in themselves are becoming, endangered or even extinct, then that's a part of me that goes with that. So there is some risks within it, but overwhelmingly extremely protective.
So I know I've heard previously in interviews where you've actually described yourself as someone who has thick skin, and you're in a role where you're definitely up against systems and in policy changes. How did you develop thick skin?
For me, developing that thick skin required me to go back and really reflect on the principles of my own law, and therefore what responsibilities do I actually hold given the position I'm in. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this yarn, I'm really fortunate to be in the position that I'm in. I've had a whole bunch of people that have helped me to get where I am, both here present and those that have come before me. And so if that requires me to just put on another layer and get out there and to have some tough conversations, then for me, it was a choice I had to make. And once I'd made the choice, that allowed me to therefore not take everything as personal. Because for me, it's not, when I'm out there and I'm having difficult conversations, I'm not out there, and even when people may be saying some, and at times very racist things back in terms of, some of the topics that I talk about, I don't take it on personally because I see it as a cultural obligation. So that's allowed me to continue doing it. And then I think over time that it's like a muscle, right? Like the skin at the end of the day is an organ. And so if I need to toughen it up, then I've had to be prepared to put myself out there and get in those situations where I have those difficult conversations, where I allow myself to go and reflect and to heal from anything that's come from that, to be able to get back in there and do it again. I think that's probably something that we forget, particularly in the field that I work in a lot, is we've been led to believe that self-care is selfish rather than, we've been led to believe we just need to be there 24/7 for everybody all the time, no matter what. Rather than, for me, self-care is the most important part of being the most effective member of the collective that I can actually be. Because if I allow myself to burn out, or if I allow myself to get filled up with negativity and become really despondent with the work I do or the world I live in, then I'm actually not the best version of me for the collective. So I've just tried to flip everything in terms of how would our old peoples have reflected on this, because they went through some horrible things that I'm never going to have to face. And how might they reflect on this, and how can I use that to get through whatever the situation might be?
Absolutely. And in those moments where people have said really racist things to you, what do you do? Like, do you call that out, or do you have to check your safety and your nervous system before you can figure out what to do next?
I generally have to check my mouth first and foremost. I have this bad habit for swearing.
I mean, fair enough. Honestly, fair enough.
There's been a lot of times where I'm like, "Are you effing serious?" type stuff, where I have to catch myself. Given the forums that I'm in, I have to reword it before I allow it to escape my mouth.
You have a different dialogue going on in your head. Yeah, we could say that.
Look, depending on the situation, there's different ways that I deal with it. Sometimes I actually find it comical. Sometimes I actually feel pity for those that haven't had the opportunity to learn. It really depends. If I'm in a situation where somebody's been and had the opportunity to learn a lot and they haven't bothered to take that on board, and they just remain ignorant, then I experience frustration like anybody else. Absolutely. In those moments. But if I'm working with people who I can tell are curious but have never had the opportunity to learn certain stuff, and they've asked me a question that's in their mind just a question that they want unpacked, I'm not going to allow myself to be triggered by their curiosity. I'm actually going to do what I can to help build their knowledge base, and hopefully that then helps them on their journey moving forward. I think at times, again, we allow our own triggers to potentially get in the way of us helping people on their educational journeys, their healing journeys, whatever it actually may be. And I understand why that happens, because, as I said earlier, sensitivity is built through exposure. But I've had the opportunity to learn, how do I catch that? How do I reflect on it so I'm responding. I'm not just being reactional.
Yeah, that's really powerful. There was something I actually wanted to talk about, because I know we spoke briefly about, where racism shows up in different areas, like across systems. But I think something I'm really aware of is like we do continue to see instances of racism occurring in public spaces, including the heckling and booing of Indigenous leaders and veterans at separate Anzac Day ceremonies. How do experiences like these affect the mental health of First Nations people?
Yeah, we can't hide from the fact that these events impact negatively on social emotional well-being for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. There is direct correlation between the experiences of racism that people are exposed to and their overall social emotional well-being. And I think the more that these events occur in large public gatherings or in very highly covered through media events, the more exposure actually occurs through that. So more people are actually experiencing, these things, which I don't think is necessarily something that we've always had to consider in the past. I think that the only way that, as a nation that we can continue to move forward through this is to really look at how do we build some cohesion? How do we build social cohesion? And for me, that really needs to get back to how can we get back to reflecting on what we have in common rather than having this constant dialogue about how different we are. Yes, my ethnicity, my cultural background is different to other people's, but I'm a human being. And I generally will have the same emotions, the same desires and needs as all the other human beings around me. So I think if we start getting back to a real strong human rights based framework for moving forward, I was watching the National Press Club today, and it was a speech by the Human Rights Commissioner and actually speaking about how Australia has been discussing introducing a Human Rights Act for a period of time now. And I actually see a lot of value in something like that because it would give us a guiding frame in terms of how do we actually need to treat each other as human beings.
Yeah.
And that doesn't actually take away from anybody's ethnicity or cultural background or religiosity. It just, if anything, it embraces all the difference and goes, well, how do we take all the difference and make us all stronger together while respecting each other?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I really hope that we can move in that direction.
Yeah. And I'm really loving that you're talking about, what's the path forward? How can we be stronger together, social cohesion, and kind of leads me to my next question of what should non-Indigenous Australians understand about their role in creating better wellbeing environments? Yeah,
the first and foremost thing that I think Australians need to not just acknowledge but accept is that colonisation is an ongoing process. We don't live in this rainbows, fairy floss coated society that governments at times like to portray, that Australia is a post-colonial nation and we've moved on from that and everything's great for everybody now. Colonisation is ongoing. We know that. Like the referendum was a prime example. If we're still in a situation where we're going to give 97% of the population the opportunity to vote on what's in the best interest of 3% of the population, that is a colonial process. So we can't escape that. We are still doing things that we've done from the past, and that continues to have an impact on the social emotional well-being of us as First Nations peoples, not just through the systemic and institutional discriminations and the racism, etc., but through the ongoing experience of oppression.
Yeah.
Because we don't have self-determination as First Nations peoples. So what we really need is strong allies. We need people to be able to face that, that cold, hard fact that everything that is gained in Australia comes at a loss to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And if I'm actively a part of that, I have to acknowledge and accept my position within that so that I can reflect on, well, how can I do less damage? And look at how do I do some more good. Yeah. So I try and live my life and I try and encourage others to live through that lens of do less harm, do more good. We can never live doing no harm. The fact that we're here and we're breathing, we're having this conversation, I'm using electricity that's come from coal while I sit here and talk to you right now. There's no point me being here just bagging out the mining industry unless I'm prepared to turn off all my electricity. But I can be far more mindful in terms of how I use it. Yeah. And they're the type of reflections I think we need to have in more and more instances. So when it comes to racism, it's like, well, I mightn't be able to stop everybody being racist, but I can be far more mindful about how I choose to engage or what I choose to stand up for.
Yeah.
And I think the more people do that, we'll have this collective swell that'll bring around a positive change.
I love that language of collective swell. That's essentially what we want to create, and having these conversations. So yeah, thank you so much. That's really, really powerful. And there was actually something that you mentioned before, and I know you referenced about you connect to law, but it's not LAW, it's LORE. Are you able to explain more about what that actually means?
Yeah, so for me, I actually would use LAW, but talking about my traditional law, because unfortunately what I think we've done in Australia again is we've positioned Aboriginal law alongside folklore through the use of LORE. Like when you consider LORE, people automatically think about folklore. It's just some stories of the past. They don't actually see the influential purpose and the governance systems and structures that are built into our ways of knowing, being, doing through law. So for me, I'll purposely position it as LAW and either call it relational law or traditional law or whatever else, customary law, whatever. But I tend to not use LORE because, unfortunately, I think what that automatically does is it positions it as lower in terms of importance, integrity, value than Westminster law, which for me, it doesn't. Like living my life through my law, which in my language, Gamil, protects me from Westminster law because it's all based around positive principles of being in good relationship with self, other, and place across time.
Yeah.
So, how do I understand notions of respect, responsibility, reciprocity, acceptance, connectedness, these things, positions of truth? They're the fundamentals of Dirigamil, so for me, they're far more of value in terms of guiding the way that I choose to live my life, the way I choose to do my work. And that could be when I'm on my country, when I'm here on Kumbameri country, or when I'm in Tokyo. It's still going to protect me.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And also just thank you so much for this conversation and sharing your experiences, the wisdom, and just the stuff that you continue to create, you and your team, the change that you're creating for First Nations people. And also, really hope this conversation inspires listeners to be stronger allies and really empower the people in their lives to create social cohesion for the good of Australia and the future. So thank you.
No, I really appreciate it. Look, all I can ever hope for in engagements like this is that everybody just takes one thing away, and if everybody just finds that one thing that, has been a bit of an insight, bit of a light bulb for them, and takes that way and reflects on what does that mean in terms of the way that I choose to live my life and I choose to engage with others, particularly Aboriginal peoples. Again, I think that's going to make a momentous positive movement.
Thank you.
Gamaninda.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and waters on which this podcast was recorded.